Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Imagine having a neighbor so nosy they call the HOA over your perfectly functional car. Here we go. Picky, nosy neighbors who have the president of the local homeowners association on speed dial are a real nuisance. One day, a few years ago, my faithful old Volvo gave up the ghost. The automatic transmission was slowly going out. The final blow was when an oil line to an external oil filter developed a pinhole leak and the engine seized when all the oil escaped. I had the car towed home and it sat in the driveway for a month or so while I tried to decide what to do with it. The options being to replace both the engine and transmission or sell it off cheap, either for parts or to someone who wanted to get it running again. I finally, reluctantly, decided to let it go. I'd miss it, as it had probably been the best car I'd ever had, and I'd done some serious upgrades and improvement to it. About this time, my neighbor called the HOA to complain that I had a junk car in the driveway that I was parting out. To hear her version, the president expected to see something on cinder blocks with no doors, the hood up, and no engine. The truth was that it was still intact with current license plates and insurance. There was no way to tell from looking at it that it wasn't running. Nevertheless, I was given 1 week to either fix the car or have it gone. The busybody neighbor was known for being extremely conservative. She made teabaggers seem middle of the road. One of the things which she had a particular dislike for was the local NPR radio station, which was associated with a local university. The station was running a fundraiser at the time, so I decided to kill two birds with one stone. I donated the car to the radio station. The appointed Saturday came around and the car was being picked up by a tow truck. When she came out to watch the proceedings with a smug look, she commented to me that it was about time that piece of junk was being removed. When I replied that I donated it to the local NPR station, her smug look was instantly replaced by horror, quickly followed by livid anger. She stalked back into her house and slammed the door. I was happy that, even to the last, my trusty Volvo had been useful. The neighbor's reaction? Priceless. Sometimes a little creative problem-solving can be the best revenge. You should have donated it in her name. Let the NPR folks show up to her house to thank her. And our second story. Manager does exactly what he's told. When you mix a load of concrete, there are a lot of variables that determine the mix strength, but the two most important ones are A, the amount of water, and B, the amount of cement. Adding water raises the slump, fluidity of the concrete and makes it easier to work, but it also raises that water/cement ratio, dropping strength. To get around that, you can add a water reducer, a chemical made to raise slump without changing the water-to-cement ratio. High-range water reducers, also known as super plasticizers, can turn curb mix concrete into absolute snot without weakening it at all. I'm not sure on the reasons why, but unlike other admixtures, including low and mid-range water reducers, super plasticizers go in at the end of the loading sequence. That means that when the load finishes, the chemical hasn't had time to work its way into the load. Until it gets mixed in, the slump meter inside the truck will still register the load as being dry. That brings us to Jake. Jake's not an inexperienced driver. He's been in the industry since I was in grade school. Most of that time, however, was spent with another company. He came to us because Jake likes to keep his truck clean, really clean, like Adrian Monk thinks you have a problem clean. After many years and several warnings, his previous employer got fed up with how much clock time he was spending washing his truck and let him go. We were happy to have him because he knows what he's doing and is willing to advise less experienced drivers, and of course his truck always looks fabulous. Unfortunately, he's also a bit abrasive and set in his ways. Dealing with Jake always begins well, but after a while he starts getting under your skin, and before you know it, you're really irritated. It's like stepping out of the shower and treating yourself to the fluffy pink caress of Owens Corning's finest. So Jake pulls under the plant and gets loaded. His load has super plasticizer in it, but he doesn't notice. Where he used to work, they stamp the concrete tickets with big red warnings for just about anything non-standard. We don't do that here. Bob, the manager, expects his drivers to read their tickets and consider what they've been loaded with before adjusting, adding water. Jake doesn't look at the weights on his ticket. He just pulls out from the loading area, looks at the requested slump on his ticket, looks at his meter, and slaps the water button like a colicky baby. Of course, by the time he goes back to check his slump meter, the water reducer is mixed in, and with the extra water, the load is now piss wet. NB, that is the actual term management uses for concrete that wet. Management's mostly comprised of former drivers. Jake calls Bob and says he needs his load dried up. It's simple enough to do. You just drop in a little cement with a bit of sand to help push it down. A full load in a mixer is 10 yards, but technically they can hold up to 10.5, so there's some extra room for situations like this. Bob's not too happy that Jake mucked up his load. Jake made a stupid mistake, and now the company has to batch some material we won't be paid for. Still, it happens, so he tells Jake to back up under the plant. Then Jake starts being Jake. He tells Bob that the sand looks wet, and he just wants Bob to drop him some powder. The sand isn't wet. Bob has a moisture sensor telling him the sand isn't wet. What's really going on is that Jake is worried he screwed up the load too much. Either he's panicking or he's lying about what his meter's reading. Either way, he thinks that one dry up isn't going to be enough, and he wants to make sure there's room for a second one. Bob doesn't hint at his irritation. He just checks the direction of the flag out on the silo, gives Jake the 10-4, and tells him to spin up his drum, set the drum to full speed, and rev the engine to turn it faster. Normally, when Bob loads a truck, he lowers the plant hopper onto the truck's hopper. That lowers a shroud around the back of the truck and turns on the dust collector, a vacuum system that sucks up any stray cement. Bob is not lowering the hopper this time. Instead, Bob loads up some cement powder and, just like Jake asked, drops it. The powder free falls into Jake's truck hopper and billows out into a dark, misanthropic cloud. The yard is set up so that the prevailing west winds would normally push that cloud behind Jake's truck and across the yard, and on this occasion, right into my windshield. Instead, a nice, healthy Santa Ana wind, a dry east wind that occasionally blows in Southern California, catches the powder, and Jake's truck gets swallowed by the nothing. When it reappears, Jake's once immaculate truck looks like he's been pouring concrete in Herculaneum. It's been over a year, and Jake hasn't asked for a dry-up since. This story, like concrete in a mixer, blends elements of humor, workplace challenges, and technical details to create a memorable tale. It prompts us to reflect on how, even in routine jobs, there's room for unexpected twists and the need for adaptability. It's informative without talking down to people, and you turn a subject that most people don't really care about into something interesting. And our next story. The trespassing Karen next door. My partner and I purchased our first home about 8 months ago. We love it. Great neighborhood, great neighbors, or so we thought. We're in the process of having landscaping done, as in having the whole front and backyards torn out and completely redone. As such, the gate to our fence is currently down so the landscapers can get their heavy machinery through. I notified neighbors on both sides this was happening in advance because I'm a good neighbor. Today, as I'm making dinner, I see my elderly neighbor is in my yard, screwing little planks of wood between the gaps in the fencing that separates our yards. I just stand there, shocked for a minute, like, WTF is going on here? I go outside and confront her, say, what are you doing? You can't just trespass in my property and screw things into my side of the fence. She responds, oh, well, the landscaper said they'd be putting the gate back up tomorrow, so I wanted to get this done right away. My dog and your dog bark at each other through the fence, and there's these little holes, so I'm covering them since the fence is on my property line. Now, I'm no lawyer or anything, but I feel pretty confident saying I'm 100% sure you cannot come into my yard without permission and just screw these ugly planks onto the fence. If it bothers you so much, why don't you put them up on your side? Probably because it's ugly, right? No answer. She stands firm that this is totally legal and acceptable behavior. Until I say I'm calling the cops, she then leaves my yard but starts going off about how there's snakes in her yard because of me, like I'm God bestowing a biblical plague upon her, and that I'm being nasty to her, and how my homeowner's insurance wouldn't pay for damage to her windshield when we got 4 feet of snow and my tree branch fell on her car. Literally, the entire city had huge branches and downed trees everywhere. It wasn't negligence on my part. I I think you did the right thing by calling her out and telling her to stop. People who feel that they have the right to come onto another person's property without permission and start altering a fence don't need any encouragement. Her comment about the tree branch says to me that she's been harboring resentment for some time. I'd get a security camera because with people like this, it tends to build. And you don't even know it. And our last story. I live on a hill and my neighbor did something stupid. A few weeks after I moved into my home, the neighbor installed a wide strip of landscaping all the way up the border between our property. I thought nothing of it until a few years later when I was doing some landscaping of my own and had reason to find the property pins. Turns out all of his new landscaping was on my property along with a $50,000 retaining wall and most of his driveway, which had been expanded years before I bought my house in order to accommodate his RV. I dug through Google's historical satellite data and found the approximate date he enlarged the driveway and installed the retaining wall, about the same time the previous owners of my home were moving in. Seemed intentional, like he was taking advantage of the fact the new owners didn't know exactly where the property line was. I also called the city and confirmed no construction permit was ever issued for that wall. A proper contract would have insisted on a survey before building such an expensive wall on a property boundary. The whole thing seemed shady to me. So I went over there to chat with him. He denied his improvements were on my property, but agreed to pay for a survey, which showed he was way over the line and occupying about a quarter acre of my land. His wife was sick at the time, so I told him, hey, let's not worry about this right now. We can figure it out next year. About 8 months later, I see a for sale sign show up. I call him up and inform him that we need to deal with this property line issue first. He agrees and has his lawyer draft papers. He brings them over and asks me to sign them. He seems nervous and in a hurry to get my signature. I review the agreement, and it's a transfer of my land to him with no compensation. I politely tell him I'm not in the business of giving land away, but that I'd be willing to sell it to him for a reasonable price. In my mind, I was thinking $3,000 to $5,000. He flips out, tells me, if you're going to be like that, then I'm going to take it by eminent domain, and storms away. Now, this guy has plenty of money. The house is a $500,000 property, one of 7 he owns, and they lived in it maybe 3 months out of the year. He can afford to pay me for the property he took. So I called up his realtor, who was not aware of the land issue. A day later, the for sale sign is gone, and about a week later, I get a call from his lawyer. By now, I've done my homework, realized I'm entirely in the right, and I've written a demand letter for removal of his improvements and restoration of the native desert landscape. His lawyer wants to buy the land for $1,500. I've since realized it's worth closer to $15,000. I told him I'd take $20,000. He dragged it out for over a year and tried every dirty trick in the book to get me to acquiesce. The house sat empty the entire time while he continued to pay all of the costs required to keep the place up: landscapers, maintenance people, taxes, and all the legal fees for his lawyer to play games with me. I held my ground and ultimately agreed to sell the property to him for about $18,000. All he had to do was be a nice person, and the whole ordeal would have cost him less than $5,000. I estimate it cost him between $30,000 and $40,000 by the time it was all said and done. This story's a wild ride, guys. Imagine moving into your dream home only to find out your neighbor's stuff's actually sitting on your property. So what would you have done in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoy our stories. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.